Então, com vocês, o professor Ferguson. Thank you very much for your participation in our symposium. In the word.
So what I want to talk about is Ancestors in Archaeology, which is a collaborative research project that I worked on in the San Pedro Valley of southern Arizona. And there are really two things I'd like to try to do in the presentation. One is I'd like to illustrate some of the processes by which we do collaborative archaeology with Native Americans or with Indians in the southwestern United States. And then the second thing, since this is a conference about knowledge, I want to direct our attention a bit to how Indians use archaeological sites and how archaeologists use archaeological sites. And in essence, what I'll be talking about is that archaeologists use archaeological sites to learn about the past, to create knowledge about the past. And Indians, on the other hand, use archaeological sites to know the past, but they learn about that past through other sources of knowledge, including their oral traditions, their religious practices, and other types of tribal traditions. And the archaeologists in Arizona, where I work, are interested in what the Indians think about archaeological sites because we think it will help us do better archaeology by allowing us to create alternative theories to the ones that we're using. And so the Indians and the archaeologists want to work together to study the past, but they do it for these two different reasons. So the project I'm going to talk about works with 4 tribes in Arizona and New Mexico, the adjacent state. And the project's based in the San Pedro River that you can see in the center of the slide. And the 4 tribes are the Zuni tribe, the Hopi tribe, the Apache tribe, and the O'odham tribe. And here you can see the tribal reservations of these 4 tribes in relation to the study area. The study area is this Hatchard area, the San Pedro River. And the San Pedro River starts in Mexico and flows to the north and joins the Gila River. And this is an aerial photograph. And so these 4 tribes that we're working with on this project include the Tohono O'odham Nation immediately to the west of the study area. And they're a desert-dwelling agricultural tribe. They speak the Piman language. And then to the north of the study area are 2 Apache tribes, the San Carlos Apache and the White Mountain Apache tribe. And they speak an Athabascan language, an entirely different language. And historically, they were hunters and gatherers who also did some horticulture. And they also have a history of raiding the non-Indian settlers and the other Indian settlers. And then to the north are the Hopi tribe and the Zuni Pueblo. And these are what we call in the United States Pueblo tribes that live in pueblos or large villages, large agriculturally based villages. And although we call both Pueblo tribes, they too speak 2 different languages and have different histories. And so we're dealing with 4 very different indigenous groups on this project. Now, our project really begins with an archaeological framework. And I did this work in conjunction with the Center for Desert Archaeology, which is a nonprofit preservation organization in Arizona. It's a nonprofit group that the mission of which is to learn about archaeology and to preserve the archaeology for the future generations. So the Center for Desert Archaeology spent about 10 years doing an archaeological survey of the San Pedro Valley. And as you can see in this map, they recorded hundreds of archaeological sites. And so they had a tremendous knowledge about the archaeology of the valley. And as you can see on the right side of the slide, there's a long archaeological sequence that goes back about 12,000 years in the valley. Goes back to Paleo-Indian times. In our particular project, we were really interested in only a part of that period, about the last 1,000 years, in a period in which the Indians who lived in the valley had large agricultural settlements. And that was really the focus of our talk. And so I'll be talking about the classic Hohokam from AD 800 to 1250. And the archaeological sequence is actually interesting because it's not one step after another. There are these interdigitations of occupation in the valley. And so during the Hohokam period, about AD 1200, you had a group of Pueblo Indians from the northern part of the state of Arizona move down into this valley in a migration. At the same time, you had another population that we call the Hohokam living in the valley. And after about 150 years, this Pueblo population either merges together with the Indians in the valley, and we can't tell them apart archaeologically, or maybe some of them return back in a migration to where they came from. We're still learning about that. So you've got this Hohokam period with this Pueblo migration that comes into it. At the end of the Hohokam period, there's a period that we call the Seviper Ii from about 1450 to 1762, a period that spans the beginning of written documents in the Southwest. And so at the beginning, we only know it archaeologically. By the end of the occupation, we have historical records that tell us about this people. And I'll talk about them in just a minute. And then beginning about AD 1690, we have the Apaches who move into the area for the first time and begin to interact with these people. So a very rich and complicated and full archaeological record. And I just want to have a few slides that give you a sense of the archaeology that I'm talking about. And so the classic period Hohokam from about AD 1250 to 1450 in this valley is really marked by platform mounds in which people built these platforms, and then they would put a priestly structure on top. And then often they would surround these by a compound wall. And so these are relatively small sites in a global scale, but for Arizona, these are pretty big sites in southern Arizona. And you can see there are more than 10 of these large villages along the San Pedro Valley. And then in addition to these large villages with these platform mounds, there are also 3 ball courts that you can see marked in red. And these ball courts were a place where we think people had a ceremonial game, a ball game. But it was probably also a time in which people came together for trading and for other types of social interaction. And so these ball courts were community focused, so quite distinctive in the history of southern Arizona. And then, as I said, about AD 1250, what we see is that this group of Pueblo Indians from northern Arizona, several hundred kilometers away, move into the valley. And you can really see this in the material culture. It's really marked. The earlier platform mound sites were built out of adobe, mud architecture. When the Pueblo people moved into the valley, they build these Pueblo buildings out of stone masonry. So it's a different architectural style. They bring with them a whole suite of material culture. These perforated plates that we think were used in the production of pottery, the particular kinds of mealing bin for grinding corn, a distinctive entryway into the houses, and then these kivas that are really quite interesting because they're Pueblo religious structures where ceremonies take place. And this particular kiva in the San Pedro Valley is identical in every fashion to the kivas that they were building in northern Arizona at the same time. Quite distinctive and very different from what had been in the valley earlier. And then there's this particular Pueblo-style pottery that's quite distinctive. And so these people move into the valley, and you can tell them apart archaeologically. There are these two archaeological traditions going on. Well, by AD 1450, the archaeology really changes. We think the people are the same. We think it's the same group of people that are living there, but they give up living in those big platform mounds and those pueblos, and they convert their housing form to these brush hut-like structures. Very small sites, very ephemeral archaeology. You can see a reconstruction of the huts here. This is what the archaeology actually looks like. You get a ring with a few stones and a few artifacts. Very diminished archaeological record from what had preceded it 100 years earlier, although they do have a distinctive pottery. So a very rich archaeological record in the San Pedro Valley. And so for archaeologists, these San Pedro Valley archaeological sites are meaningful in a number of ways. They provide a record of environmental history, how the valley has changed in terms of the environment. It's an opportunity for archaeologists to study social and cultural change and how networks of people interacted in the valley and with other areas. It's an opportunity to study migration, people moving into the valley and moving out of the valley. It's an opportunity to study ceramic development, how the pottery changes over time. It's an opportunity to study changing land use and to study culture history, the history of the peoples that live there. And so that's how these sites are meaningful for archaeologists. So after a decade of research, the Center for Desert Archaeology felt like they knew a lot about the archaeology, but the question was, what does this archaeology mean for the indigenous people, for the Indians whose descendants still live in the area? So they invited us to do this collaborative research project to try to address that question. And here in this slide, you can see a group of Tohono O'odham Indians standing around one of those brush huts. Not much visible on the surface, but there are these rocks that if you were standing there that you could see that they're standing around. So the question is, what does the archaeology mean for the Indians? And that's what I work on in this project. So we developed this as a research collaboration with these 4 tribes. In the United States, Indian tribes are recognized political units with well-established governments. And so we went to each tribal government and said, this is the research we want to do. This is why we want to do it. And here is Bill Doley, who's the director of the Center for Desert Archaeology, and my colleague Roger Anyan, and myself in a meeting with the Tohono O'odham Tribal Council to talk about this research. And we did similar kinds of meetings with all 4 tribes in which we talked about the research, and they had an opportunity to help us develop the research questions that would make sense to them. And in addition to the research questions, what the appropriate methodologies were for addressing those kinds of questions. And so from the beginning, we worked hand in hand with the tribes trying to build a project that would provide useful information for ourselves as archaeologists and as anthropologists, and also provide information of use to the tribes. So we designed the project to include fieldwork with the 4 tribes. We worked with each tribe independently, 1 tribe at a time, because the tribes are concerned about their cultural information, and they wanted an opportunity to work with the archaeologists and to decide what information they wanted to share with other people. And that includes other Indians as well as non-Indians. And so we did independent fieldwork with the 4 tribes. We designed the project to take all 4 tribes to the same set of archaeological sites, so we would have a common basis for talking about the history in the valley. As I'll talk about in a minute, that research design evolved a bit with one of the tribes, with the Apache tribe. But here you can see the Apache on the upper left, the Hopi on the lower left, the Zuni on the upper right, and the Oodam tribes doing this fieldwork phase of the project, in which we went to archaeological sites to talk about the archaeology. In addition, we took the tribal research teams, our research partners, to museums to look at the material that came from these sites. And here you can see a group of Zuni Indians at the Amarin Foundation Museum looking at the pottery that comes from one of the Pueblo sites in the San Pedro Valley. It was quite a fascinating discussion at this museum and the other museums that we went to. You can see the beautiful pottery on the table, and the Zunis and the Hopis as well could recognize the designs that are on the pottery and show us how those designs are identical to the designs that they still use on ceremonial objects at the Pueblo, and they could interpret the meaning of those potteries for themselves in terms of things that you would expect from an agricultural people, symbols for rain, farming, fertility. And that's what they saw in this pottery at the museum. We also did a workshop with Hopi women who make pottery. We weren't able to take them to the museums, and so photographs of the pottery to the Hopi reservation and had an all-day workshop with the women where we looked at the pottery, and they talked about the techniques for building pottery and how the designs on the pottery are similar and the colors are similar to what they still make at Hopi today, and so they were really helpful in that way. Now, it's not possible in a short lecture like tonight to go into detail about our findings, and so what I'm going to do for a few minutes is just illustrate really one point about each tribe's history in the valley to give you a sense of their history. And so let me start with the Hopi tribe. The Hopi tribe, when they visited these archaeological sites, put these sites in the framework of their history. And their history, Hopi is a very complicated pueblo because it's composed of 12 villages. The tribe has 12 different villages on 3 mesas in northern Arizona. And in these 12 villages, there are about 60 clans. And the Hopi history is really carried by these clans. It's each clan has a history of where they started and where they came from. And it turns out that about 15 of these Hopi clans, their history is that they started in the Valley of Mexico and migrated northward to the Hopi mesas. And along this migration, which took many, many generations, they say, they lived for a time in a place called Palaquipi, the red-walled city. And they're not sure exactly where this place is, but they know that very important things happened at that place. It was a time of social strife, and people weren't getting along, and it resulted in the Hopis being forced to continue their migration to where they are today. So this place, Palaquipi, is quite important to them. And so the San Pedro Valley is located right here. And you can see if you map the Hopi migrations, as is done in this map, the San Pedro Valley is along the area that they migrated. And so they look at the archaeological sites in the San Pedro Valley as the footprints of where their ancestors walked in the past. It's the physical evidence of this migration, and that's the way that they relate to this. As we were talking to the Hopi Indians about the San Pedro Valley and their history there, we began to understand that for the Hopi, this idea of place has elements of both time and space. When they're talking about Palaquippi, they're talking about a particular point in time as well as a particular geographical area. And so place has elements of time and space. And it also became clear that places may represent time periods, and that they use those places and those time periods to structure their historical narratives. So with the Zuni Indians, again, one of the two Pueblos tribes that we worked with in the northern part of the area, with the Zuni tribe, they too have a long history of migration that's not carried in their clans, it's carried in their religious societies. And you can see here, this is the Gila River, and our study area is actually off of this map to the south, would be where this arrow is pointing to the south. And so our study area is not shown on this map. But the Zuni Indians have a history that they originated in the Grand Canyon of Arizona. And then they migrated up a valley called the Little Colorado River. And they got to a point where the tribe split into different parts, 3 different groups. One group came directly to Zuni Pueblo, one group migrated to the north, to the Rio Grande, and then back to Zuni Pueblo, and a third group migrated to Zuni Pueblo from the south. And then there was a 4th group that they talk about as the Lost Others, because this is a group of Zuni Indians who decided they would go south to the land of everlasting sunshine, and they never returned. And that's the group that the Zuni Indians think is associated with the San Pedro Valley. And so for the Zuni, visiting these archaeological sites created an opportunity that prompted them to talk about their memory and their history. And so that was our experience with the Zuni. Now with the Taona O'odham Nation, the agricultural people who live to the west of the study area, we spent all our field work talking about this group called the Seviper Ii. And you could see people like the O'odham man who's speaking here, not understanding who we were talking about, sort of scratching their heads and going, who are the Seviper Ii? By the time our fieldwork was done, it was like a light bulb came on. All of a sudden, this man said, oh, you mean our cousins from the east? You archaeologists give them this foreign name. We don't know who you're talking about. But these are our cousins from the east. That's how we know these people. And these O'odham people, because of the history of losing land, Indians losing their land in Arizona, they had never had an opportunity to go to these places and see these sites, but they had heard about these places. And so when they got an opportunity to go to these places and see them, they're able to put their history together with what they were seeing on the ground. This particular history is directly connected with the O'odham because in 1762, we know that the Spanish had established missions in Arizona, and they were worried about attacks by the Apache. And so the Spaniards wanted to gather together all of the Indians that they could into a small number of settlements so you'd have a very large settlement that could be defended against the Apache. And so in 1762, the Spaniards convinced these cousins from the east, these Seviper Ii Indians, to leave the San Pedro Valley and to move to San Javier de Bac that you can see in this photo here, which is where the O'odham people live today. And so that was their history. Now with the Apaches, especially with the San Carlos Apache tribe, it turned out that they were really more interested in the places that have Apache names, the mountains, the springs, the areas that have named places, than they were in the archaeological sites occupied by other people. They didn't see the archaeology that we were taking them to as having a direct relation with their history. And so they were really interested in working on place names. And so we adjusted our research And we said, great, we can take you to this valley and you can look at your place names research and we can help you do that. And so that's what we did. In particular, there was one historical incident that they were concerned about, and that was the Camp Grant Massacre in 1871. And that's a time when the Apaches had been persuaded by the United States Army to go to a military reservation and to quit raiding other non-Indian settlers and other Indian tribes, and to sort of be pacified by the Army. And in 1871, as a group of Oodam Indians and a group of Hispanic settlers from Tucson, Arizona, and a group of Anglo settlers from Tucson, Arizona, came up to where they were camped and killed about 120 people at dawn. And so this is a very traumatic massacre that they still remember at camp at the Apache tribe. And so that was really part of their focal point. And it was an interesting exercise in remembering and forgetting, because people knew about this massacre, but not everyone knew where it was. For instance, this man, Mr. Talgo, said that when he was young and his family would ride horses down this valley to collect acorns during part of the collecting season. And he always thought it was interesting because when they passed through this valley, his parents would get very silent. And there would be no talking going on and no discussion of any kind. But they never told him why. And they never told him this is the place that the massacre took place. And it's not until he went to college and started to read in the history books that he was able to put together, there was this massacre, and that was the place that happened. And so they were forgetting it, in a sense, at the same time that they were remembering this. And so they were really interested in the place names associated with this one particular event. And here you can see 12 places illustrated on a map, and these are the places that after the massacre they went to hide for the next few weeks or month or so, from place to place, trying to avoid further strife. And so they were able in this project to record these places and put them on a map, and then to share that information with us at the end of the project. So a lot of our research really is predicated on a theory of cultural landscapes as memories, in which the land, going to the land and looking at the places in the land creates this opportunity for people to think about their history and their culture. It brings those things to mind. And so going to these places is a way to talk about and do history. And what we've found is that there are cultural practices that bridge the past and the present in these tribes. And here you can see the kiva I talked about, one of the sites in the San Pedro Valley at the Davis site. And this kiva, which is where the Pueblos continue to do many of their religious practices today. As I said, it was identical to the ones from the same time where the Pueblos live. Well, when we took the Hopi researchers there, one man very quietly went and sat in the kiva for a long period of time and made a tobacco offering, a prayer offering. He sat and prayed in the kiva, and you could just sort of sense directly how the past and the present were connected in his cultural practices at this particular place. So we come to understand on this project that as archaeologists, we want to study artifacts in the present to learn about the past. And so the past and present are different for us as archaeologists. For the Indians that we were working with, The Indians use artifacts and landscapes to connect the past ancestors with their present day customs and beliefs. So the past and present are simultaneous for the people that we were working with. And so we have two different ways of looking at it. So we began to think about the elements of the cultural landscape that we were working with, and how people go and they see the environment and the artifacts on the land, and then they filter their understanding of those artifacts in the land through different dimensions of time and space. And on this particular project, we began to think about time and space in three ways, or three dimensions. One is absolute time and space, relative time and space, and representational time and space. And through that filtering process comes a cultural meaning that people apply to these places. So my colleague Chip Cowell-Chanthapon and I developed this very simple time and space paradigm in which we wanted to try to understand what people were really telling us, because what we found was sometimes where people, the Indians we were working with, they were talking about the past. Other times they were using the archaeological sites to talk about the present. And so we wanted to try to understand what are they really telling us so we don't misunderstand the information that they're sharing with us. And so we have developed this very simple paradigm of time and space that includes absolute, relative, and representational time and space. So in the way that we understand it, absolute time and space is bounded by the physical properties of the time-space continuum. So that would include things like chronology, topography, latitude and longitude, all of the things that provide an absolute way to know a land. Relative time and space is socially defined. There are fluid boundaries dependent on the nature of the space and the individual defining it. And representational time and space is when a place is encoded with symbols and values that provide cultural and historical meaning. And I'll illustrate a few of these. So this illustrates space, and at the upper left you can see the absolute space. This is Big Sunflower Hill. It's a real place. It exists in a particular area that can be mapped. This is a relative space, literally relative, because this is Rosalie Talgo's father's house. And so that particular space she understands relative to her family who resided there. And then you can look at it in terms of representation on a map. This is Big Sunflower Hill. And then you can also look at it verbally, Nadlid Cho, which is how the Apache people say this place in their own language. So turning to time to illustrate this, we have this absolute time because with an example from the Oadam, it's absolute because we know in 1762 the Spanish authorities convinced the Seviper Ii to leave the San Pedro Valley and settle at San Javier de Bac in the Santa Cruz Valley. Absolute. We know the year that happened. Turning to relative time, we have statements like the Apaches telling us, after the Camp Grant massacre, my grandfather farmed at Sunflower Hill. And so that's a relative placement of time for an event placed in relation to something else, and not a particular date. They don't remember it was 1871. They just remember it was after that massacre. And then there's the representational time, as I talked about with Hopi, in which we're talking about Palaquapi was a time of great unrest that caused my clan to migrate northward. And so they're talking about a representation of time, not an actual time in terms of our non-Indian calendar. So a few more illustrations. Here you can see relative time and representational space. As I mentioned, the Apache's statement, after the Camp Grant massacre, my grandfather farmed at Big Sunflower Hill. And so it's a relative time. It's an event that's placed in relation to something else. And the representational space here is this really quite interesting map from the 1880s. And it's interesting because the areas that the Apaches farmed after the massacre are these irregularly shaped areas. This is the farmland of Escaminosan, and this is his pasture area. Areas that were irregular and conforming to the topography and the water resources of the area. And then when the United States took the land in the 1800s, the United States imposed the Public Land Survey, which is this rectangular grid that you can see overlaid on top of the Apache land. And then they used that Public Land Survey to give that land to non-Indians. That was the way the non-Indians could register for that land and get it, was through the Public Land Survey. And so here you have a representation of Apache use overlaid by the land that was taken by the non-Apaches. Another example is at the Reeve ruin, one of these Pueblo sites in the San Pedro Valley where the Pueblo Indians migrated. And so looking at the variables that we were interested in, when we visited the Reeve ruin in the San Pedro Valley in 2006, we were in an absolute time and an absolute space. We knew exactly where we were in the San Pedro Valley. We had our GPS coordinates. We can put it on a map. And we knew the year we were there and the day of the month, and so it was an absolute time as well. Now, when the Hopi started to talk about their history, then they began to move from absolute time into a more representational time. And they're saying this site is related to our clan history. And so they're beginning to move into a representational time. And then they start talking about Palakwipi, or the Zunis start talking about their lost others, and they move into a representational time and a representational space. And so trying to understand what people really were telling us was the exercise of this paradigm. And then in the Camp Grant massacre, that I mentioned, you can look at it in terms of absolute time and space by academic historians, by Apache historians, or by archaeologists. We can look at it in terms of absolute time and space. This massacre has been the subject of a number of historical novels, which are, they're novels. They're just made up stories that are loosely based. And that moves the discussion into a more relative time and space because the massacre is related to the characters in the novel. Now, when the Apaches talk about the Camp Grant massacre, as I was saying, a lot of them don't know where the absolute space is. Their parents have kept that from them for cultural reasons. And so it begins to move into a representational time and space in which the Apaches are talking about how they were treated and how they interacted with the non-Indians who moved into the area. And so it's a very representational. And then here, you can look at it in terms of absolute space and representational time. And in the United States, we have a national register of historic places. And so this Camp Grant massacre is registered as a historic site. And you have a map that locates it in absolute space according to the latitude and longitude and the public lands survey system. And so we know exactly where the massacre took place, in part because of the archaeology that you can still see on the ground. But if you go to the form itself, what you find is that this place, this absolute space, its significance is representational of something else, which is warfare between Indians and Americans in Arizona. So it's a very representational meaning that's attached to it. It's not the massacre that took place that gives its historic significance for the United States. It represents a time of warfare between Indians and non-Indians. And so it's absolute space, representational time. And then finally, and as this example, it's absolute time and representational space. In Arizona, the first Europeans that came was an expedition in 1540, the year 1540, by Coronado, who came from Mexico to go up to the Pueblos. And so we know the year precisely, 1540. But where he went in Arizona, no one, it's a matter of debate. But nonetheless, the state of Arizona has designated this highway as the Coronado Trail Cultural Highway. And so they use that highway, where we don't know that he went, to represent historically his expedition. And so it's an absolute time and a representational space. We actually think that Coronado didn't follow this trail. Most of us in Arizona now think that he came up the San Pedro Valley, where our work was conducted. So that's a little bit about the project that we worked on. When it came time to write the results up, we have done that in a series of articles, and we also wrote this book, History is in the Land, talking about these experiences we had with the tribes, and also talking about how that affected us as archaeologists. And we wrote this book so that it could be read in several ways. One way is you can read this book and read our academic text. And then we juxtaposed our academic text with direct quotations in italics from the tribal people that we worked with. And so you can read the book as a text in its entirety, or you can read just what the tribal people had to say. And it tells a very similar narrative using different frame of reference and different words. And then we also designed it, although it's not illustrated here on this page, we also designed the book so that if you just wanted to look at the photographs and the maps, you could just look at it visually and get a sense of the story that we were trying to tell. And so it's a book we think works on a different levels for different people. So what we found is that there's different discourses between archaeologists and Indians, but a lot of the knowledge is complementary. We're all talking about a mosaic of land, history, and culture. We use different terms to talk about that, but that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about, on this particular project, how we can share the past and present from learning from one another. The Indians are learning from us because they get taken to places and have allowed access to places that they wouldn't go otherwise. We get to learn from them. And so it's a mutual benefit to everybody. And then in Arizona, unlike Brazil, where you have a strong law to protect your archaeological heritage, we really have a problem with vandalism, where people go dig in sites for private gain to sell artifacts. And so the Indians and the archaeologists in Arizona have a common bond to try to protect these places from vandalism and from development, mines, and roads. And so we share that. And so we have similar themes from different perspectives. And one of the themes I've talked about or mentioned in the talk was this idea of migration. And so archaeologically, we can create maps that are based on artifact distributions. And we can trace the movement of people through artifact distributions. And we can come up with this kind of map. For the Indians, they have a view of migration that's based both on petroglyphs, on the material record, but also on their traditions. Among the Pueblo people, this spiral is a migration marker. They say wherever they see that spiral, that represents a migration. And in the San Pedro Valley, they said, look at this one. It not only represents migration, but it provides a map of sorts that shows where people went and the convoluted route that they took to end up where they are today. And then they combine that physical evidence of the petroglyph with their oral narratives about their migrations and the clans that you can see represented in the surrounding landscape. And they could put those two things together. They put the oral tradition together with the material record to develop their interpretation. So as archaeologists, many archaeologists in Arizona value indigenous knowledge because, as I said, it offers alternative theories and interpretations that are useful in structuring scientific research. We have people who are taking these clan migration histories and then saying, archaeologically, what do we expect to find? And then they're going out and seeing if they can find that evidence archaeologically. As I started the talk, saying that Indians don't need archaeology to know their history, but they value archaeological knowledge nonetheless because it provides details that aren't recorded in indigenous traditions. And so here you can see an archaeological excavation along a highway that was being constructed in the San Pedro Valley at the time we did our work. And the Indians are talking to the archaeologist about what they're finding in this particular house structure. And, you know, as I was saying, the Indians have their history of migration through this area, and they think this site relates to that migration. But what the archaeologist finds in the ash pit is the food that people were eating at the time they lived in that house. And so that they find out what people had for dinner, what kinds of wild plants that they had, what kinds of domestic plants they had, what animals they were hunting. And the Indians know that generally, but they don't know that specifically about this particular place. And so they find that archaeological knowledge useful because it provides those kind of details about the lived human lives of their ancestors that is not encapsulated in their traditions otherwise. The point of view of the native peoples has helped archaeologists. In the Southwest, where I'm talking about, we have these archaeological cultures: Ancestral Pueblo, Patayan, Hohokam, Mogollon. These archaeological cultures that are really abstract groupings based on material culture similarities in different geographical spaces. So those are archaeological cultures. And we have this idea in terms of ethnogenesis that it's kind of a branching off of these cultural groups. Well, when you talk to the Indians, like the Hopis that I'm illustrating here, the Hopis have this concept of Hisatsanem, which is ancient ancestors. And they say their history demonstrates to them that these ancient ancestors lived in each of these archaeological areas. And so this red circle representing the Hisatsanem encompasses all of the archaeological cultures. And their view of ethnogenesis is a very complicated, like a spider web of relationships in which people move from one area to another area and back again and then forward. And so it's a really complicated migrational pattern. And so from talking to the Hopi Indians about this, I think as archaeologists, we're getting more sophisticated in understanding that it's not so simple a branching diagram of cultural development, but it's a much more reticulated graph, and that's a complicated social situation in the past, and that comes from talking to the Indians. So in conclusion, I just want to say that archaeologists value sites because of their information, and that Indians value sites because of their connection with their ancestors. But both of these perspectives complement one another in terms of understanding the past and in terms of trying to preserve the archaeology so that we have that record to work with in the future. So thank you. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them in Portuguese and someone will translate for me.
Eu queria só que ele falasse um pouco sobre essa ideia de conhecimentos complementares, que eu não entendi muito dessas questões complementares, assim, complemento o quê, assim, se é conhecimento científico, o que ele está falando, o que é esse conhecimento e o que é esse complementar, E eu queria saber se nesse trabalho dele com esses 4 grupos...
He's asking me about complementary, complementary knowledge, what you're thinking about knowledge, and to what it is complementary, if it's complementary to complementar com arqueologia ou com conhecimento indígena.
Conhecimento.
To what is complementary to archaeology or to e aí?
Não, e se nesses 4 grupos que ele trabalhou, teve algum sítio arqueológico dessa região assim que de repente teve algum problema de um interpretar de um jeito e o outro interpretar de outro e tem um conflito entre as interpretações e como é que eles trabalharam com isso?
In 4 different groups that you worked with, there was different points of views, and then you disagreed, and how was the tension between the different interpretations between those groups?
So there's a couple of...
She wants to ask more, and then you answer the same? Okay.
It's a couple of questions to answer in your question there. And one is, how are these knowledge complementary? And I go back to this slide that shows the archaeological view of migration and an Indian view of migration, and those two complement one another. Different sources of knowledge, but they work together to give us a better understanding. And it's interesting because with the Pueblo groups, the history is told of clans, and archaeologically, we really don't have a very good way to recognize a clan archaeologically. We're just beginning to try to figure that out as archaeologists. And so having this strong history presented from their oral tradition is forcing us to, as archaeologists, to develop more sophisticated method and theory that we can identify that these groups that they're talking about. And so it's complementary in that sense, in that it sort of builds a knowledge together with 2 parts being joined together. And the second part of your question dealt with 4 groups and how do they get along and were there tensions. And there were. The 4 tribes that we were working with all want to get along with one another, and so they don't play up their differences and make them into overt hostility. But the southern tribe, the Oadam tribe, right next to the study area, they didn't understand when we started this project, they didn't really understand how the Hopi and the Zuni from hundreds of kilometers away, how could they come down and say these are their ancestors? And so there was some tension about that. But through this project, they were able to hear from the archaeologists how it's pretty clear from the material culture that these Pueblo people from northern Arizona moved into the San Pedro Valley. Look, the pottery is different, the architecture is different, all of these things are different. And so they begun to understand the complicated aspect of their history. And so it never became a problem for our research, this tension between the tribes. And the tribes are working really hard to try to work together because, all archaeology takes place in a social, political context. And the fact is that Indians in Arizona want to stand together with one another because they have to all of this outside political force that's really against them. And so they want to stand together as much as they can. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Who are these Indian investigators? They have some formal preparation for in archaeology, or they are representative of these indigenous committees.
So the question is, who are the indigenous collaborators? Do they have formal education, or is it these committees of elders? And the answer is that this is one project, and there are many other projects, and so it's a complicated answer. On this particular project, we worked with these groups of cultural elders who are organized by the tribes to work with anthropologists and archaeologists on these questions, to share their tribal knowledge with scholars so they can advance what we all know about the past, and so that they can get their story represented in the books that we write. So it's just not from our point of view. I work on many projects with these tribes, and with the Hopi tribe and with the Zuni tribe, they have their own archaeological companies, and they have trained archaeologists. And in fact, on the San Pedro project, one of the people from Zuni doesn't have a college degree, but has 20 years of training doing archaeology. And so he was the logistical person that brought the elders down and participated in the research. At Hopi, the projects that I'm working on currently, I work with Stuart Kayemtiwa, who is finishing his master's degree in cultural anthropology at Northern Arizona University. And so he's a scholar getting an advanced degree in anthropology, and he's the one who helps put me together with the cultural advisors. And so it's a mix of trained scholars and tribal elders with the knowledge, and tribal members who have spent a good part of their lives doing archaeology that work on these projects together.
I have a question about the type of agreement you have with the communities about how much of the information can be published.
That's a good question. It's about the type of agreement that I have with the communities. And it varies on project to project. And so I'm going to answer both specifically for this project, but also generally for the kind of work that I do in general, much of which is related to development. So it's cultural resource management, CRM, or heritage preservation. And generally, when the tribes hire me as an anthropologist, I sign a contract with them that gives them the rights to my intellectual property. And so they own my field notes, my photographs. The right to publish is done in collaboration with the tribe, with their approval. And so it's a very clean, from their perspective, they're hiring me and they own what I do. And that's fine, because I get a lot of benefit out of it. On the San Pedro project, it was a little different because the tribe wasn't hiring me. We developed funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we went to the tribes and said, look, we're going to apply for this grant. We can create an opportunity, and we can take it forward from there. And so the way the research process works on this San Pedro project is I don't speak these languages, and so we do the research in English. But before it gets into English, the Indians can talk among themselves in their own language, and they can decide what information to put into English. And they know when they put it into English, then I write it in my field book, and that's the first step in terms of publication. And so when we did this project, we used the tribes as a form of peer review. And so the written report that we did to the funding agency, and then the book that we did, was reviewed by the tribes before it was published. And so they didn't own that information, but they helped us review that information to make sure that it was accurate. and that it didn't reveal information that they think should remain within the tribe for certain people. You know, when you do research with Indians, at least in the United States, they get excited about what you're talking about. And sometimes they want you to know personally. As a person, they want you to know something. And so they go on and on and on. It's like focusing a camera. They go a little bit out of focus with too much information. And so then it's during the publication process that we then bring it back into focus and focus on the information that the tribe really wants to share. And so there's this very fluid dynamic. And so I mentioned the projects that I work on outside of the San Pedro project where the tribes own my work. And then this other project where they don't own the work, but they have it's a collaboration. And so we work together and to try to figure out what to archive and what to share. And it really works the same for me personally as an anthropologist, the same in either one. These are the people I'm working with. They're my research partners. They're going to help me decide what we want to publish and why we want to publish it, and that it's appropriate to publish that information.
Say that time, in the case of time, present, and past, they're together. So how do they deal with this idea of time and space in three different categories that you mentioned?
That's a good question. I should go back and ask them how they deal with that, because that's really the paradigm I was presenting was how the non-Indians were understanding what they were saying. But the Indians that I work with in these 4 tribes, they're all pretty sophisticated people. And they have the ability to, at one and the same time, think traditionally, and at the same time, try to do the anthropology of anthropologists to figure out how we think and why we think what we do. It's very quaint. It's so foreign. You know, and how do you guys think this, and why do you think that? And so it's a two-way street. We're studying them, and they're studying us. And I think, like Stuart Koyamtua, who I mentioned getting his master's degree, he has the ability to, at one and the same time, understand the traditions and understand these outside ways of thinking and see where they meet and where they don't meet. That's not a very satisfying answer, but that's. I'm going to go back and ask about this more. My next project.
The experience I have in collaborative archaeology in the South is a demand from the Indians. I'm right now in the research. I'm trying to, in the beginning of the research, trying to understand what they want from me and what results do they expect to the research. And what we're on right now is they want archaeology to go back to their land and pass to the young people who have been through the city and are in this search for their so-called cultural identity, who they are right now. What Dominique said a lot about learn to be an Indian contemporarily. They're in this process, and they look at archaeology as one tool for that, and especially related to the land, and then the land have to their land rights and try to prove to the white, in one sense, and to them, to their young, who didn't live the culture, that were in the cities and they're going back. That's one thing. And they're trying to think about their objects and preserving their objects for this visual memory for their young. So they're trying to do their objects again. And they're coming to me to ask me to take them to the museums and show what the white collected and think about their material culture, and try to then discuss among them what artifacts are meaningful for them right now, and they're creating on that. So creating a new image of what is Chopin right now. And I was wondering, after the research stopped or ended, what were the results for them? How did they incorporate this academic view, and how did they use that? I mean, it's lots of things that they could use for that. How did it come?
That's a good question. And did everyone hear the statement? And so on this particular project, there, what I didn't illustrate was we published a 16-page color magazine and printed 1,000 copies for each tribe. And so we, for the public, written for a public audience, we describe what's in this academic book in 16 pages, lots of photographs and maps and statements from their elders, and those were very popular with the tribes. They were free; you could hand it out, and so those are very popular. But the real power of this project and other projects like this is not so much in the academic publications; it's in the it's in the men like Dalton Taylor, Hopi, who go to these areas and they see these things, and then they go home and they tell their family where they went and what they saw, and then they go into their kiva and they tell all the members of their kiva group where they went and what they saw. And so the dissemination of information is harder to measure because you can't say, well, there's 5 articles in a book, and therefore it's a successful project. But you can see if you work on these projects how that information goes back to the tribe from tribal member to tribal member and has a big impact, I think. I've been on other projects like in the Grand Canyon where we've come back and they gather together all of the families of all of the men and have a big dinner. And so there may be 30 or 40 people who get to hear what these people learn. And so it's a very different kind of, it's an oral process of disseminating that information back. And then, of course, as these tribes send their young, smart tribal members off to college, well, then some of these tribal members then will come across the academic publications. Just like I said, the Apache man who learned about the massacre in college from reading history books. And so that's another way of that information getting back eventually to the tribes. So.
Just one more. Another thing that I'm dealing with the same project is these 33 of the Chopin members are university students, and they're starting this undergraduate specific indigenous university, and I'm one of the teachers of this group, and one of the ideas was there was this work that they had to do, and it was free, which kind of theme and format they wanted to bring. And then most of the groups worked about objects, storytelling, medicines, memories. And part of that group, as I said, they're in this process of becoming Chopinian, talked a lot about their history. And then in the end of the presentation, they would put the records and what they used to tell the other Chopin, academic Chopins as they call themselves, was Greg Urban. So this new creation of the past and present has already very different perspectives that they are using. So as you said, they have their native perspective and the academic perspective that is already in their own narratives, because anthropologists and archaeologists, much more in that time, anthropologists are working with them since the 80s. So that is already part of their view. And what I was going to ask is that this different views, as you said, well, he can do both, right? He can know what's native and what's not. Yes, but as in other researches, publications you have, we don't have to have one discourse, right? We have to give space to different voices or different perspectives on their own history, but not one thing. How do you deal about this overlapping of views of space and time as it's so mixture?
As I illustrated in the book that we wrote, we tried to make that space by providing a narrative in the voices of the people that we worked with that was side by side with our academic narrative in small pieces as side notes throughout the book, and that's one way that we tried to do that. But in Arizona, on some projects, the tribes want that space. And they want to see their history represented along with the archaeological history. They don't want to try to say one is right and the other is wrong. It's just an opportunity to be multivocal in that way. But on other projects the tribes work on, especially those that relate to land and water rights, what they're looking for is a straight scientific study that they can then take into a court system or a governmental agency and try to convince the powers that be to make a certain type of decision. And so really, there's not one answer because there's so many different kinds of projects that the tribes work on. The other thing is that on all of these projects that I'm working on with the tribes, all of the school teachers go, this is really great, and we're not teaching this in the school. And so how do we get this information from the academic package into the curriculum for the schools, beginning with the primary school and the high schools? And there, all we can say is that we're really eager to help with that. But if you're a school teacher, you know that curriculum development's not easy. And you need someone who really has the skills to do that. And so we're talking about how we'd convert this into curriculum for schools, but we haven't really taken that step. We're trying to put it together. Although I am working on a project right now, funded by the National Science Foundation, which is an ecological study of fire in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico for the last 2,000 years. And on that project, we hired an outreach coordinator who's an educator. And she's actually working with the scientists on this project, which includes dendrochronology and geomorphology, as well as archaeology and anthropology. She's working with all the scientists to convert that into school curriculum that then provides that more satisfying result. And from watching how successful this is, we're just in the middle of the project, but from watching the success that we've had so far, I can see doing that on future projects, hiring someone like her who's an expert on and taking that scientific information and putting it into schools. Well, I want to thank you all for inviting me to Brazil. I think you're doing exciting anthropology and archaeology in Brazil, and I'm been honored to have learned a little bit about it from being at this conference. So thank you very much.